Hello everyone, welcome back. I am Douglas Johnson. I'm a meditation teacher, spiritual teacher, ordained minister, yoga teacher. Um, I am a certified Kiloby inquiries facilitator. And if you're interested in health, healing, happiness, spirituality, truth, then you're in the right place. So today I would like to talk a little bit about the difference between blame and responsibility. And you can think of this as you are not to blame, but you are responsible. So there's often a lot of confusion about this. Many people see their condition in life as being the fault of somebody else. And in my experience, there can be a phase in healing where it's necessary to really put blame on someone else. But ultimately, I'd like to show you in this talk that really there is no such thing as blame, ultimately. But again, at a certain phase or stage, we may need to blame another. So a few things I'd like to discuss today is the difference between blame and responsibility. What is blame? What is responsibility? Why you would want to take responsibility, right? Because we might feel like, this person's to blame, so I don't want responsibility. They did it. They should take responsibility. Well, we'll explore why you would want to take responsibility. And then, again, ultimately, why the idea of blame is really an illusion. The fact that we could blame something on one person, or you could say blame only makes sense from a very limited perspective, one perspective, or a limited perspective, an egoic perspective. And when we really let go of that and we see a broader perspective or a more inclusive perspective or multiple perspectives, we can see where, blame doesn't make as much sense. So before we get into that, if you enjoy this kind of content, then please like and subscribe. And if you'd like to support my teaching, please check out my Patreon page. The links are below. I don't get any money for making these videos. So these videos are made possible by my patrons on Patreon. If you are a patron, thank you so much for your continued support. So, why would you want to take responsibility for your own health, happiness? Why is that preferable to blaming your health, your current, present health, happiness on others, on the past? Why would you want to do that? Also, why is there ultimately no blame? It really does seem like other actors, other people, circumstances, the past are to blame for what we're feeling now. So isn't it better for us just to say, well, mom and dad did this to me. This person who bullied me did this to me. My brother or sister, whatever it is, they did this to me, and that's why I am currently miserable, unhappy. Why would we ultimately want to let that perspective go? We'll explore that in a minute. First, we need to look at what is blame and responsibility. Well, I can think of a few examples. I'll start with one that is relatively, I think, benign. So let's say that you work in a retail store and you are responsible. One of your responsibilities is keeping that store clean. So every day you go through, you mop up the floors, you do whatever it is to keep the store clean. Now let's say one day somebody comes in and they're browsing the aisles and they're carrying maybe a baby who's crying, and they're carrying this baby, and they are looking at, say, salsa. And the baby reaches out and pulls a salsa off the shelf, and it comes down on the floor and it splatters all over the floor. So conventionally speaking, at least, again, we'll explore later why blame is sort of an illusion, but conventionally speaking, we could try and blame the baby, right? People don't often blame babies because it's obvious there's hardly any good in it, right? Most of us don't actually think the baby understood what it was doing. You know, you're not going to get reparations from a baby, right? You can blame the baby, but it's not like a court of law is going to say, okay, baby is responsible for cleaning up the salsa. So a lot of us would maybe then want to shift over to the mother. Mom's to blame. Mom shouldn't have brought the baby. Mom should have done whatever. Okay, well, you know, that mother, what are the chances that you're going to get her to clean up the aisle, to clean up the salsa? Maybe you get her to pay for it, but at least in today's environment, that's not expected of a customer. If a customer knocks over a display and all of the contents spill on the floor and glass shatters everywhere, I don't think there's a way to get the customer to pay for that. Maybe you could take them to court or something like that, but chances are they're not going to have any real responsibility for what happened. So we can blame them in our mind. We could be like, that darn customer, that darn baby, you know, we can do all this. We can get angry, we can get upset, but hopefully you're seeing how that is really going to be fruitless. It's not really going to yield any good results. Now let's go back to this example where you're actually in charge of keeping the store clean. That's your responsibility. It's in your contract. It's in your job description. So baby knocks over the salsa, spills everywhere. Who's responsible for cleaning it up? You are. It may not seem fair, but in this example, I think we all see, okay, yes, maybe you're not to blame, but you're responsible, right? So if your superior, your boss comes in and the salsa's on the floor, right? And it's your job to keep the store clean. That is your responsibility. And your boss comes in and sees a salsa on the floor and they say, hey, why is this on the floor here? Why is this mess here? What's going on? Do you think if you went to your boss and said, well, a woman came in with her baby and the baby knocked it on the floor, so I was thinking the baby should clean it up. The baby is to blame, so the baby is responsible. Do you think that that's going to fly? Do you think your boss would say, oh, that makes a lot of sense. I think you're right. Why don't we wait for the baby to grow up, take responsibility for its actions, and then clean it up. We'll just leave that there until the baby, right? Is that going to work? Does that make any sense? Does that seem productive? I think we can see just on a practical level, it's not really realistic. Again, we can try and say, well, mom's old enough. Mom should take responsibility for the baby. Again, at least in our current environment, I don't think anyone realistically is going to think that's going to happen, right? What are the chances that mom is going to put baby down, grab a mop, clean up the salsa? And again, you go to the boss and say, hey, boss, well, this lady did that. This lady's baby did that. Since it's her baby, I think she's responsible. right? It's in your job description. The boss is going to say, look, I don't care who's to blame. It's your responsibility for keeping the store clean. So you clean it up. Grab a mop, clean it up right now. So this is one example of blame versus responsibility. Sure, baby is to blame. Maybe by proxy, the mom is to blame, right? Because we could say, well, mom shouldn't have brought baby in. You know, should have, could have, shouldn't have. These things, spiritually speaking, are often phrases that we want to be very careful when we're using them, because very often we're actually causing ourselves unnecessary suffering as a result. So this is an example of a difference between blame and responsibility. So now let's look at an example that might be a little more spiritually relevant. Let's say that at a certain point, through doing inquiry, maybe meditation, maybe psychotherapy, at a certain point, I realized that one or both of my parents are responsible, or not responsible. I blame them for my current deficiency story, for my current psychological programming, conditioning. Identify that, you know, my parents really seemed to withhold their love when I did certain things, acted in a certain way, and that caused me to repress certain emotions, certain aspects of my personality. And for me, it's tempting to blame them. And let's say that at least in certain perspectives, certain ways of looking at it, that that's perfectly legitimate and it makes sense. Maybe your psychotherapist even says, hey, you know, this isn't your fault. So again, the difference between fault, blame, and responsibility. So this is a good example, I think, because again, fault, blame, who's to blame? Who is at fault for something? Again, we'll explore later why in ultimate understanding, there really is no such thing. But for now, let's just, relatively speaking, let's say, yes, our psychotherapist says, hey, look, you're not at fault. You're not to blame for your condition. Your parents, you know, your grandparents, your teachers, whoever. Maybe in an even more extreme example, maybe you actually have trauma. Perhaps you were abused physically, mentally, emotionally, sexually by, again, when you were a child, when you were relatively helpless. So again, it's not about who's responsible in the sense of, oh, you were a child and you wanted to be physically abused, or you wanted to be bullied, or it's your fault, right? You are to blame. No, of course not. You were, you know, some people get abused from an age before they even have any kind of rational understanding of anything. So to say that they are to blame or they are responsible. Now, some people might try relating this to like karma. And I don't really want to get into that today. So we could make the argument that, okay, if you are a child and you end up being abused, that is karma and that you had done that to somebody before. And so now it's being done to you. Again, I don't really think that that's helpful for our discussion today. If that is a belief that you have, that's fine. But I don't think that that's that helpful or relevant to our discussion today. So let's leave that metaphysical perspective that, oh, if something horrible happened to you when you were a child, well, that's just because you had done something horrible to someone else at another time in another life. So this is just the scales being evened. Let's leave that discussion out. So again, we could say mother, father, adult. If we were a child, we were traumatized in some way. It was the people who had a greater understanding who should be held accountable there. We should blame them. It's their fault that I have this conditioning now, that I have repression, that I have trauma, right? So again, we can see where it is they are to blame, it is their fault, if you will. We could say that anyway, from one perspective. But the question now is, who's responsible? Let's say you were abused by your parents, flat out. They abused you in some way. Now you have trauma, right? Now you've grown up and you have trauma. But let's say your parents died when you were relatively young. They abused you, but now they're gone. Does it make sense for us to now say, well, since they were the one that abused me, they're responsible for healing me. They're responsible for my unhappiness in this moment. They're responsible for my failures. I know people who want to take this view. They basically look to the past and they say, these people did these things to me, and that is why I'm unhappy today. That is the reason why I'm miserable, why I'm suffering, why I'm a failure, why I can't find lasting, loving relationships, why I'm not my best self, whatever it is. So again, that is trying to give the people who are maybe to blame or at fault responsibility, right? You're responsible for how I feel today. So many of you have heard me say this in the past, maybe not in the same way, but spiritually speaking, we do not want to give others responsibility for our health and happiness, because as you can see in this example, mom and dad abused me, now they're dead. Well, how can they take responsibility for what they did? They're gone. So I may want them to pay for my psychotherapy, but they're gone, they're dead. I may want them to pay for my spiritual retreats and meditation and working with a spiritual healer to become whole again, but they're gone. So again, we see from a pragmatic point of view, it doesn't make sense to give them responsibility. We may want to, but since you're the one living your life, since you are the one carrying these traumas, these memories, the conditioning that resulted from what happened, just like the clerk in the store who is responsible, you are the one responsible. We may not like that, and I'm not saying that it's fair from a surface level perspective. On the surface, it seems very unfair. It seems that before we had agency, before we had rational thought, before we really understood what was going on, things were done to us that are affecting us, and it should be those who did those things that are now responsible. So, how do we know, spiritually speaking, that we're responsible for dealing with these aspects of what we find in ourselves? Well, my answer to that is that if we weren't, the universe would fundamentally be set up in a different way. So for instance, if our parents were responsible for accounting for all their missteps, for all the ways they mistreated us and maybe abused us, or didn't take the time to understand us and ended up traumatizing us, then they would have to account for that before they were out of our lives. They wouldn't die before we had reconciled that with them. It just wouldn't be possible if that were really what were necessary for the scales to be even. Now, some people try and appeal to the idea of an afterlife, or again, of karma. Now, that's fine if you want to believe that, but I need to make the distinction between belief and actually what we can know to be true. Anything we can know to be true, we can know in this moment, and we can verify in this moment. Belief is something about future or past. So ideas like heaven, well, they won't get into heaven. You don't know that. That's a belief that you have. You may even have faith in that belief, but it's still a belief that you have. You can't go inside right now and actually see your dead parents before God being judged. That's not something that you have access to or knowledge of. You can have maybe a priest or somebody reassure you that that's what's going to happen, but you don't actually have knowledge, firsthand experience of that. So this is the difference between esoteric and exoteric spirituality. So esoteric is about going inside and experiencing spiritual truth in this moment. We're not waiting for karma. We're not waiting for heaven and hell. We're not waiting for some other being's judgment to even the scales. Rather, what we want is to find happiness, fulfillment, bliss, healing in this moment. And what we find is that the only way this can happen is if we take responsibility. Because again, even if my parents are alive, or whoever it is, the bullies who bullied me, my abuser, my sexual abuser, whoever it might be, even if they're still alive, I may not be able to pull them before me and get them to willingly take responsibility, right? Even though maybe in theory it's possible. Why would I want to take responsibility? Again, this, I think, can oftentimes leave a sort of bad taste in our mouth. Shouldn't the person who is to blame, who is at fault, who made a mistake, shouldn't they be the one to take responsibility for cleaning up the mess that they created? And again, we see, spiritually speaking, the way that I put it, if that really were what were meant to happen, then that's what we would see happening. Again, you might have some kind of thing where ghosts, maybe you think you're not responsible and then you die and then you find yourself before all your victims, essentially responsible for rectifying the situation you created. But that's not what we see happening. And again, if you have a belief system that tries to sort of deny the reality that we're experiencing, that's fine. But in my experience, that doesn't help us in this life, in this moment. Those beliefs, I think, oftentimes actually are counterproductive for our spiritual growth and for our happiness and bliss that we are responsible for. So why would I want to take responsibility, right? I didn't create the mess. It wasn't my fault. I'm not to blame. Why would I take responsibility for my own health, happiness, for the suffering that I am dealing with that seems like somebody in the past is to blame for? And the answer is very simple: power. When you take responsibility for your own happiness, for your own health, when you stop relying on others to take responsibility for their actions, for what was their fault, for what you believe they are, at blame for, then you take your power back. If you like, stop the video right now and just take a moment to explore that. mom and dad are to blame, or my husband is to blame, or my children are to blame for my unhappiness. This is what our ego wants us to believe. We are powerless victims, and it's others, the other, that is to blame for my suffering, for my lack of health, for my lack of happiness. The government, again, this can take any form. Parents, government, ignorant people, unspiritual people, unenlightened people. I've seen it take all kinds of forms. They are to blame, okay? Again, as long as I believe this, I'm giving my power away. And then you can, again, pause the video for a moment and think about, no, I actually am taking responsibility for my happiness, for my health. From this moment on, if I haven't up to this point, from this moment on, not only am I taking responsibility, but I believe it's possible for me to achieve these things. I have faith that it is possible for me to take responsibility for health, for happiness, for living a blissful life. Not only am I taking responsibility, I believe I have the power to achieve that. Now, whether that power comes from you personally, or you think it comes from a higher power, right, from God, or whatever name you give to divine source, energy, cause, that's not really that important from my perspective. What is important is, again, that you feel that you have access to that power and that you take that power. And this is a mental thing. This is why this is a spiritual teaching. Because physically, yes, we might be powerless. We might be in a situation where we are powerless to change what is. But what I've learned through exploring spirituality for the majority of my life at this point is that we can change how we feel. And that's what really matters to us. How do we feel about anything, the world, our situation? We can change that. We have a lot of power to change that. How we are interpreting events, how we are seeing other people, how we are seeing ourselves. So this is the most important thing for us in reality. Because again, I can have $1 billion in the bank and I can be depressed. I can be suicidal. I can be unfulfilled. I can be unhappy. I can have no money, no possessions, and be grateful and in bliss. And we have real life examples of this. Okay, we have people who, like Gandhi, who had like almost no possessions, and yet who wielded great power and lived a very fulfilled life. Okay, and then we have people who are billionaires, millionaires, who have a lot of money, and we find they're very anxious, very nervous, unfulfilled, unhappy. So this isn't just in theory. We can see this actually in real life. So why did I say earlier that ultimately there really is no such thing as blame? I'll say this, that these talks are really about spiritual reality, and it's not about conventional reality. So spirituality tries to point to a deeper truth, one that transcends what our senses and what our experience and what conventional wisdom might tell us. Now, here's the difference between blind faith and actual faith. And again, esoteric, which is what I try and teach you, esoteric spirituality versus exoteric, which is, the future and heaven and belief oriented. So this is not about belief. This is actually about experiencing this for yourself. So I want to take responsibility because that brings me back my power. The other side of it is ultimately, in A Course in Miracles and in Christian teaching in general, the idea of forgiveness, non-judgment are very, very important. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. And this goes even further in that nothing can happen to us that you could say is not willed by God, if that's how you want to think of it. Or you could say nothing can happen to us without the entire universe conspiring to make it so. So again, in order for someone to steal money from me, money has to exist. Money has to be invented. So we can say, oh, so-and-so stole the money from me. Well, we're taking for granted that there is money, that, so many things, that physical reality exists, that we and them exist as separate entities. So this is a little bit of a heady concept, and if you're a little confused by it, that's okay. I just want to plant the seed. But in order for any events to happen in reality, we need gravity, right? We need air, we need human beings, we need the planet Earth, we need the solar system that we're in, we need oxygen. Human beings are made out of carbon, carbon-12. Carbon-12 comes from stars collapsing in a supernova and then exploding, and that happening many, many times to create the element we call carbon-12. So initially, the only thing that existed in the universe was hydrogen, right? So these are things that we as human beings, we don't think about. We just say, oh, this happened, that person was the trigger, so they're to blame, they're at fault. Now again, on a practical level, a societal level, we may need to punish somebody, discipline somebody, arrest somebody, put somebody in prison, hold them accountable. So these truths are not about how should society be structured or what is justice or ethics. This is about, again, our internal life and living a fulfilled life, reaching our full potential. So again, this idea of taking responsibility gives me power. That's why I want to do it, not because externally it seems like I'm responsible. No one would say that to someone who's the victim of abuse, right? We know who's responsible. But again, this is a spiritual truth. I want to take responsibility because that empowers me. Likewise, let's say we were bullied by somebody. Well, if we look at the psychology of a bully, usually a bully is someone who's been bullied. That doesn't make what they did right. But we can see that the bully wouldn't have bullied had they not been bullied. So we take a step back and say, well, okay, Joe bullied me, but Joe was being bullied by his father. So his father's really to blame, right? We see that there's now causation going back. Well, then we look at his father, we say, you're to blame for my abuse because you abused Joe and Joe abused me. Well, then we look at his father and we find his father is a vet. His father maybe was not abused by his parents, but he went through a traumatic situation. It wasn't addressed. He wasn't given any tools for healing or for context. He was just told to man up. So this is why he abused his child. So then we take the blame off of him and we say, okay, it was the war to blame. Well, who caused the war? Well, it was the President of the United States. Okay, so the president's now to blame. And then we look at the president and we look at his situation and we find that there were certain politicians putting pressure on him. There were other governments putting pressure on him. And that's why he made the decision that he made. So we can keep going back infinitely looking at causation until we end up at first cause, right? If we want to think of it in scientific terms, the Big Bang. If we want to think of it in terms of the Bible, Genesis, or whatever it is, that everything caused everything else. Maybe you want to say, well, it wasn't Genesis, it was the fall from grace in the garden. Well, who put the snake there, right? It was God. So is God, again, God ends up being responsible for everything, created everything. So again, if we want to blame somebody, we can blame first cause. We can blame God if we want. But again, as per this talk, that really doesn't get us anywhere because it makes us powerless. Do we really want to blame our suffering on the Big Bang? Does that get us anywhere? Does that help us reach our full potential? Does that make us powerful? It may take responsibility off of us, but again, as I pointed out, responsibility is actually how we get power. So we don't necessarily want to give away that responsibility. In fact, I would encourage you to take it. So again, this is a rather advanced concept, but if you are following along, you can see where really ultimately blame goes all the way back. That if we get beyond the surface, Joe bullied me, so Joe is to blame, right? If we look, why did Joe do what he did? Because he was bullied. Why was he bullied? Because the person who bullied him was traumatized, right? And we go back and back and back, and we find cause after cause after cause after cause. And again, if we keep going back, you know, why did that even happen? Oh, because human beings exist. And human beings have free will. Why do they have free will? Because God decided it was a good idea. You know, on and on and on. So hopefully you can see where something that makes sense from a very limited perspective. Joe bullied me. Joe is to blame for my pain. We see that really isn't true. It ultimately isn't true. On the surface, and yes, maybe in society we need to punish Joe or do something so Joe doesn't do that again. Again, that's a different issue. But we see, spiritually speaking, that that's not really ultimately true. And spirituality is about ultimate truth and reality. And when we really see what's true, when we really tune into that, we get our power back. And our power, our spiritual power, is what we need to be able to live a happy and fulfilled life. All right, everyone, I hope you got a lot from today's talk. Please reach out if you have any questions about this. You can leave that in the comments, either on YouTube or on Patreon. Again, thank you to my patrons who make these talks possible and support me through thick and thin. I really appreciate you. And if you'd like to become a patron, you can please check out the Patreon page. There's a lot of content there. It's all accessible. But again, it gives you an opportunity to support me if you like. Until next time, everyone, namaste and have a beautiful day.